Good morning and welcome everyone to this hybrid event focusing on the ongoing conflict in Sudan. Before proceeding further, I would like first to acknowledge that GW is located on land long tended by the Nacotcheng, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples, and its early facilities and profits relied on enslaved labor. Addressing historic injustice does not end with this acknowledgement, but with ongoing work and struggle that should involve all of us. I am Niemat Ahmadi, an anthropologist, feminist, and Islamic studies scholar. I'm also currently directing the Institute of Middle East Studies here at GW. In addition to the work and the support of IMIS, in particular our colleague here, Christian Clinton, thank you, Christian, for all your work. This event is co-sponsored by the Arab Center, and we have a representative from the Arab Center here, welcome, as well as the Institute of African Studies and the Humanitarian Action Initiative at the Elliott School. We are very fortunate and grateful to be able to put together this important discussion about the ongoing conflict in Sudan that has received far less international attention and support that it deserves, and that contrasts markedly with other world crises. Before introducing our guest speakers, a few very quick announcements about upcoming events at IMIS. On Friday, October 6th, we will be hosting Dr. Christiane Gruber from the University of Michigan, who will be presenting a talk entitled From ISIS to AFD, Ultraist Rhetoric and Visuality in Orientalist Concurrence. That's taking place Friday, October 6th at noon here in the Elliott School in this room, 505, as well as on Zoom. On Wednesday, October 18th, we're hosting a film screening of the film Israelism that'll feature a discussion with the filmmaker Eric Axelman and our own professor Ari Dubnov. That event is taking place Wednesday, October 18th at 5:30 here in the Elliott School, but in a different room, room 113. As for today's event, it is my great honor to introduce our three speakers whose expertise we are so fortunate to benefit from today. First, we have Dr. Nisrin Elamin, who is absolutely vital in making today's event possible. So thank you, Dr. Elamin. Dr. Elamin is currently an assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at the University of Toronto. She received her PhD in anthropology from Stanford University just recently in 2020. She is currently writing a book tentatively titled Stratified Enclosures, Land, Capital, and Empire Making in Central Sudan, which focuses on Saudi and Emirati land grabs and community resistance to land dispossession in the Jazeera region of Sudan. In addition to scholarly articles, Dr. Elamin has also published several op-eds, including in Al Jazeera, The Washington Post, OK Africa, and Cultural Anthropology's Hotspot series. Before pursuing her PhD, Dr. Elamin spent over a decade working as an educator and community organizer and researcher in the US and Tanzania. Welcome. Second, we have Samah Salman, who is an executive leader in Sudan's private sector with experience in the renewable energy, agriculture, food processing, food security, livestock, oil and gas, and telecom industries. Samah has led social innovation initiatives to address development challenges in the areas of food security and climate change in Sudan. Samah is also president of the diasporic civil society organization, US Educated Sudanese Association, that was established to support the democratic transition of Sudan, and that is working to find innovative ways of addressing the humanitarian crisis created by the newly emergent war in Sudan. She has provided think tanks and media houses such as the Voice of America, the Financial Times, Al Jazeera, BBC World, and the Africa Report with Sudan analysis, and various government agencies with policy recommendations on Sudan. Samah is a graduate of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in finance and management. She has won multiple awards, of which the Tutu African Leadership Fellowship and the AFLI, with the AFLI and the University of Oxford. So welcome. Third, and joining us from New York is Niemat Ahmadi, a native of North Darfur, Sudan. She is the founder and president of Darfur Women's Action Group, a women-led anti-atrocities nonprofit organization, and the founder and CEO of Unique 22 LLC Strategies. Ms. Ahmadi is a veteran human rights and genocide prevention advocate and a seasoned strategic planning and management professional. She has a long track record of working with international NGOs for over 23 years in various fields of emergency, development, and policy advocacy in Sudan and internationally, including working as the Director of Global Partnerships for United to End Genocide and the Save Darfur Coalition in the US and with Oxfam Great Britain, International Technology Development Group, now known as Practical Action, and the UN World Food Program in Sudan. She has traveled extensively around the globe and across the US, speaking in hundreds of international conferences and providing expert testimony before high-level policy forums, including but not limited to the UN Security Council, the UN Human Rights Council, the ICC, the Senate, the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to bring the voice of women and the Darfur survivors on a global stage. So welcome, and welcome you all. Each of our speakers have prepared remarks. After their prepared remarks, we'll open it up to them to pose one another questions, and then we'll open it up to further questions from the audience, both here in person as well as online. So once again, welcome to our three speakers. Thank you for coming, and welcome to you all. I will hand over the stage to Dr. Elamin.
Thank you so much. Would you like me to stand there? Or?
You're welcome to present there or here, whichever you prefer.
Maybe you can just tell me if I'm not projecting enough. I can, it's okay? So I want to thank the organizers, especially Dr. Ahmed and the IMES Center for hosting this event, for inviting us to be here, and really for keeping our eyes on Sudan at this very critical time. The UN recently acknowledged that the war in Sudan is currently the deadliest in the world, having turned the country from one that hosts one of the largest populations of refugees on the African continent, 1.1 million, to producing over 5 million internally displaced people and killing thousands. In fact, on June 15th in El Geneina, West Darfur, a massacre took place of over 1,000 people in one day. So that gives you a kind of sense of the scale of this conflict. Before I start, I'd like to take a moment to honor and remember the countless Sudanese who have lost their lives at the hands of Sudan's military elites and actors, not only since April 15th, but over the last several decades. I also want to pay homage to the many martyrs of Sudan's December Revolution and to the sacrifices ordinary civilians, members of resistance committees, independent unions, and other grassroots formations are making, particularly in the war-affected regions of Darfur and Khartoum, fulfilling the role of an absent state and to an extent also an absent international aid community, leading relief efforts, emergency response rooms, communal kitchens, emergency medical care, converting schools and other public spaces into shelters, distributing food and other resources. So I'm not a political analyst. In fact, Samah and Niemat know a lot more about Sudanese politics than I do. I'm just an anthropologist studying land grabs in central Sudan. Most of my family, with the exception of my parents, who I evacuated with because we were there during the war, remains in and around Khartoum. So that's the position from which I'll be speaking as a member of the diaspora. And I'm going to start today with a short anecdote to briefly try to historicize how we got here. Sudan's December Revolution is often compared to Sudan's 1964 revolution, sparked by clashes between students and police at the University of Khartoum before mushrooming into a broader movement that toppled Aboud's military regime, or to the 1985 revolution, triggered by price hikes that toppled Jafar Nimeri's regime. But I want to trace its genealogy back to the 1950s. I should really begin in the 19th century, but in the interest of time, I'll start at independence. Britain's parting gift to Sudan at independence in 1956 was an economy dependent on the extraction of cash crops like cotton and on the exploitation of farmers and landless workers, and a political system which was constructed to serve the interests of riverain central Sudanese elites at the expense of the South and other peripheral regions, including Darfur, but also of a rural population that sustained this extractive, export-oriented economy. Some of the initial forms of resistance against the new post-colonial state unsurprisingly came from tenant farmers, who organized to demand, among other things, a greater share of profits as world cotton prices plummeted. A strike took place on a cotton scheme near Kosti shortly after independence. The state responded with extreme violence. Over 300 striking tenant farmers were shot on the fields or suffocated in detention cells. Elders in my family are still haunted by the tragedy of farmers suffocating in overcrowded, poorly ventilated cells. A year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between South Sudanese demanding political representation and regional autonomy and the central government made up of elites, who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony. This 1956 massacre is linked to the Civil War because striking farmers were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive, violent campaign against Southern rebels. I highlight this moment because it reveals the way state violence in Sudan has long been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive war economy that serves elite interests by any means necessary. In more recent decades, and certainly under the al-Bashir regime, we saw this manifest itself in the form of an ethno-nationalist, monocultural Islamist project being imposed on a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious country in violent ways, which was increasingly included gender-based violence against marginalized women. We saw this play itself out in Darfur, where a state-sanctioned campaign of genocidal violence led by the Janjaweed, now known as the Rapid Support Forces, was carried out beginning in 2003, killing hundreds of thousands, if not more, wiping out entire villages of Zaghawa, Masalit, For communities and displacing millions of Sudanese civilians. And while this campaign went through various phases, this violence never really ended. It fell out of the headlines, but it never ended, it expanded. A few days before the war, I read a report documenting various incidents of violence and killings perpetrated by the Janjaweed and its allied militias in southwest and north Darfur, as well as West Kordofan in March. The long war came to the capital on April 15th. And we saw this also play itself out, we see this play itself out now with various military actors and factions vying not only for political, but also economic control of the country. On the one hand, we have the RSF and its allied Arab militias, whose leaders control much of the illicit gold trade in the country, which ends up getting funneled through the gold markets of the UAE and sold abroad. And on the other hand, we have the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and its allied Islamists, who control much of Sudan's economy. Close to 200 companies in rubber, livestock, wheat, and other food commodities, cement, real estate, and construction, which are in turn backed by an Islamic banking system and Gulf financing, to put it very crudely. And so part of how we got here is shaped by these historical continuities. There were two phases during the transitional period, right? The first phase started after al-Bashir was a 30-year dictator, was ousted by a popular revolution, and then that's the first phase, to the October 2021 military coup, sort of an alliance of opportunity between the RSF and the SAF. And the phase after the October coup, where UNITAMs took the lead in attempting to negotiate towards a transition to civilian rule. In phase one, we saw the backbone of the revolution, the neighborhood resistance committees, of which there are 8,000 across the country, working class unions, independent farmers associations, feminist organizations, youth and student formations, the kind of grassroots civil society that has mostly resisted NGOization. We saw these popular grassroots elements of the revolution sidelined during the formation of the transitional government in favor of civilian elites and experts, many from the diaspora, who attempted to open Sudan up after decades of isolation due to US sanctions to international donor funding, so turning outward, and attempting to implement political reforms within a context where power was always tilted in favor of the military actors, who at the time had formed, as I said, an alliance of opportunity in order to hold on to power and launch their counter-revolution. And so we saw all political attempts to move us towards civilian rule under then civilian leader Hamdok fail, because the power was tilted towards the military actors. Instead, we saw neoliberal economic reforms being adopted that, in my view, deepened a pre-existing economic crisis, in part because civilian elites were oriented outward rather than towards the very clearly articulated demands that were coming from people and from the many civilian actors that I mentioned. In this phase, we saw the negotiation processes and the proposals coming out of them reflect an increasingly elite, male, neoliberal, urban, Khartoum-centric agenda, which sidelined the needs and demands coming out of the more marginalized rural areas of the country. The October coup was partly triggered by Hamdok asserting that only 18% of the state's resources are in the hands of the government. And he was attempting to have the companies owned by the security sector, by military elites, be turned over to civilian-headed government ministries. And so then here we had these two known war criminals, Hamidti, head of the RSF, Al-Burhan, head of the Sudan Armed Forces, responsible for war crimes that span decades, launch a coup in violation of all the agreements that had been signed during phase 1 of the transition, then being legitimized and propped up by UNITAMs, by the UK, the US, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE through the negotiations that took place during the second phase, instead of being brought to justice for the war crimes that they've committed. Anytime we inch closer to tilting the power more in favor of civilians, they staged a coup or orchestrated a massacre to break up a powerful 3-month sit-in in front of the military headquarters in June of 2019, or signed a peace agreement in Juba in 2020 with an alliance of Sudan's armed rebel groups from Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile regions who were subsumed into the transitional government. And they used this peace agreement essentially as a platform to gain more legitimacy and to bring some of the rebel leaders into their fold by trading peace for power and resources. As my friend Khulud Khair has pointed out, the Sudanese armed forces have negotiated and signed over 27 peace agreements over the last decades. They've become experts at signing and negotiating peace without ever implementing peace or being held accountable for using peace agreements to consolidate their power at the expense of civilians. In this context, peace has been used as a currency by military elites to buy themselves immunity and to absolve themselves of the war crimes that they've committed. And these mistakes are being repeated, in my view, if we now look at the process shaping the Jeddah talks, as well as the AU, IGAD, and Egyptian-led talks. There are these like 3 tracks, of which I'd say the Jeddah talks are sort of the most, supported at the moment, from which civilian actors have been excluded and which remain Khartoum-centric. When the first ceasefire agreement came out from Jeddah, for example, at the beginning of the war, Darfur was not even mentioned, which brings me to the role of Gulf actors. Now, I find it hard to talk about external actors in this war because there's a danger of overstating their role and absolving the military actors of the responsibility for this brutal war. And I find the proxy war framing, this kind of claims of this being Putin's war or a rivalry between the UAE and Saudi Arabia inaccurate. I mean, they are important actors, but it's not a proxy war. So instead of discussing the way external actors are fueling this war, you can read about that in the news. I'm going to draw on my research to talk briefly about the role Gulf actors have played in restructuring Sudan's agricultural sector, co-creating with Sudanese government elites the conditions for food insecurity in a country once touted as the breadbasket of the Middle East. In the early 2000s, the Bashir regime began implementing neoliberal policies to privatize the rural sector and to withdraw state extension services and inputs from small farmers in order to attract foreign investments in land. And I should say, I'm focusing on central Sudan. In the peripheral regions of Sudan, this looked a lot more violent. But in a country where 60 to 80% of households rely at least partly on the agricultural sector to make a living. In central Sudan, where I do my research, which has historically been a stronghold for the regime, most of the deals were signed with Gulf investors. Since the early 2000s, Saudis and Emiratis have invested over $27 billion in Sudanese land, real estate, and infrastructure. Most of these deals were signed with Sudanese military elites and a handful of allied business elites in the private sector. And while I don't have time to to get into this, I think we have to understand Saudi Arabia's role in hosting the Jeddah talks at the moment in relation to their desire for stability over democracy and civilian rule in order to protect their many interests, right, in the country. There are several civilian kind of led initiatives emerging right now that will likely not receive the legitimacy and international support they deserve and they need to succeed because stability has been prioritized over civilian rule by some of these actors. Together, the Emiratis and Saudis control over 1 million acres of fertile Sudanese land near the Nile and on top of large underground aquifers, which may seem insignificant, but the larger picture is that these shifts in land ownership have led to smallholder farmers going into debt and being forced to sell land to local elites. And so we see a kind of mushrooming of medium-sized agribusiness farms as many are forced to become seasonal farm workers in large Gulf or domestic-owned farms locally or further north. In brief, the agricultural sector has changed significantly since the 2000s, upon recommendation of the World Bank, I may add. People are farming, but increasingly no longer on their own land, and they're farming less sustainably, less subsistence foods. In fact, if you travel south of Khartoum into the rural areas, you'll see large farms growing primarily water-intensive alfalfa and animal feed that is exported to dairy farms in the Middle East. So it's not really about food security. The farm organizers I'm in touch with now tell me that this war has exposed this restructuring of the rural economy because people don't have the same capacity for growing and storing subsistence foods and are more dependent on imported foods and foods brought in from Khartoum than they were a decade ago. And it's worth noting, and part of what these shifts have caused a kind of decimation of the local dairy industry, for instance. It's worth noting that the army and the RSF are currently Sudan's biggest employers, which enables them to prey on and recruit nomadic dairy producers whose livelihoods have been undermined in this way because they've lost access to grazing routes. People are eating more white bread and less nutritious sorghum-based foods due to these shifts. People in the rural areas south of Khartoum are dealing with massive price hikes, food shortages, regular disruptions to supply chains, while also hosting one of the largest groups of internally displaced people from Khartoum. The planting season began in June this year, but most farmers were not able to farm. They weren't able to purchase the seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides they needed to farm. And there have been, electricity disruptions, which is where they draw the water from. Government storage facilities have been looted primarily by the RSF, and so people are anticipating the possibility of widespread famine. The UN estimates that over half the population is food insecure and in urgent need of humanitarian assistance and protection. Calls by independent farmers' unions for international aid to be diverted to farmers so they could plant were largely ignored. And so people are surviving through collective organizing and volunteering in Central Sudan, communal kitchens, emergency medical relief, response rooms, etc. But there are limits to how much people can do when there are no salaries and food shortages and the planting season fails. And so I guess I just want to end by saying a little bit about kind of the role of the diaspora. I think the diaspora has a large role to play in supporting the kind of grassroots civilian actors on the ground, amplifying their voices. And I'm going to be sort of self-reflective for a minute. I think the international diplomatic community and members of the diaspora have sometimes played a de-radicalizing role that undermines the political power and potential of revolutionary organizers on the ground, especially in this kind of last period. The international community has spent a large amount of money and resources on processes that legitimize the military coup regime and the warring factions, in many ways undermining the work of moving us towards full civilian rule. And some diaspora elites can sometimes take up too much space and play too large of a role by, for example, occupying key positions on the elite civilian side of the transitional government and steering the country economically and politically onto the same neoliberal path that triggered the revolution. I think at this point, we need to take the neighborhood resistance committees, of which there are 8,000, seriously as political actors and other grassroots formations. There are many also in the rural areas like farmers associations. This question of land reform is really key, right? And land has not been taken seriously yet during the transition as something that needs to be resolved. These groups the resistance committees have published multiple revolutionary charters and proposals representing different parts of the country that lay out what a transition to civilian rule should and could look like. And they've been, filling the void of an absent state, but they're not being taken seriously as political actors. And so I think that's an important step where the diaspora can play a role. I think they're proposing a kind of framework for bottom-up popular democracy that represents an alternative to elite politics in Sudan and has a potential to address the many failures, gaps, refusals of elite political actors. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Professor Ahmed. It's such a pleasure to be here with Professor Elamin, and this is going to be a very tough act to follow.
She claims she's not a political analyst, but that type of analysis, I think, I hope you've certainly taken notes, and I look forward to the discussion section of this panel. What I'd like to do is talk about the war in Sudan from a humanitarian lens. I also want to talk about Sudan as a country of both potential, the enormous economic potential and economic opportunity, and just juxtapose that with the current crisis and just explain why this crisis needs to end. I've just come back from New York from the UN General Assembly meetings where I've attended some sessions on Sudan. So it's been very interesting to see Sudan from the lens of the international community. I'd like to start my presentation just with a quote from UN General Assembly, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who has said that the scale and speed of Sudan's descent into death and destruction is unprecedented. This was at a UN pledging conference in Geneva, and this tells you just how dire and desperate the situation is. Martin Griffiths, who is the UN humanitarian chief, has also described Sudan as currently being the most challenging spot in the world for humanitarian workers. So this is not just a war that a war that has been sparked and that can be resolved through some simple negotiations. This is a situation that is one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history and one of the most complex and tackling to resolve in terms of even achieving something as basic as a ceasefire. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to just try to look very high level at the humanitarian crisis, some of the spillover effects on neighboring countries, some of the drivers and motivations of the two generals, although Professor Elamin has really given great context, so I'm just going to try to overlay it a little bit. Again, Sudan's economic potential, and I'll touch on the Sudan-Russia-Wagner relationship. Just an interesting fact, I mean, we think of Sudan in terms of how it has been embroiled in crisis and at war with itself since independence. But Sudan is a country with a fascinating heritage. Sudan is home to 255 pyramids. I know that Egypt has larger pyramids, but we have more pyramids, I like to say to my Egyptian friends. Sudan, before the start of the war, was the sixth largest host of refugees in the world and the second in Africa. So Sudan has been a home for refugees. The fact that we are now producing refugees is in stark contrast with the situation before the war. 1.1 million refugees as of March, mostly from South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. Sudanese currently are dying. Their deaths from bullets, but also of hunger, illness, and disease. We're talking about continuous food, medicine, power, water, internet shortages. At the outset of the war, diplomatic missions, UN INGOs evacuated immediately. One of the INGOs described the littering of corpses and dead bodies on the street as akin to the movie Armageddon. The reported injuries are around 10,000. Those are the official estimates. The unofficial estimates of people who have been injured is 50,000 or more, and we really don't have a real accurate grasp on that number. There have been reports of babies dying in orphanages. 70% of hospitals are currently out of service. Dr. Elamin has already mentioned that Sudan currently has the largest number of internally displaced people in the world, and I'll just repeat those numbers: 4.2 million IDPs. There were already 3.3 million IDPs in Sudan before the war. 7.5 million IDPs, 4.2 million new IDPs. The UN has estimated that total 3 billion in humanitarian assistance is required to help with the acute humanitarian crisis. Only about 1.5 billion has been pledged, and only about a third has been paid. So there's a massive gap there. When we look at the Sudanese who have fled Sudan, we are talking about 1.2 million Sudanese who have fled Sudan to other countries. And that is in addition to the number of Sudanese currently displaced, which we've said is the highest in the world. So 273,000 to South Sudan, almost 500,000 to Chad, Central African Republic, about 20,000, Egypt, 320 to 350,000 Sudanese have fled through the border to Egypt. Ethiopia, about 80,000. Some of the smaller effects, I mean, there is a lot of, destabilization of the region, the Horn of Africa region. What you're seeing is that the two belligerents of the war are armed to the teeth. And so you're seeing a surplus of arms moving into countries that are already unstable and at risk of being further destabilized, like South Sudan, Chad, Central African Republic, and Ethiopia, which has just come out of its own war and is now embroiled in another civil war within the Amhara region. To give some context, Sudan achieved independence in 1956. Sudan has had the highest number of coups in Africa. So you're talking about a country that has really been led by autocrats and dictators, and the transfer of power in Sudan has really been from one military regime to another. And between what you'll see is periods of civilian rule interspersed between long periods of autocratic rule, and the most recent was the 30-year rule of Omar al-Bashir. Sudan also has the longest running civil war, the first and second civil wars, which ultimately ended in the secession of South Sudan, the newest country in Africa. And this picture here reminds me of a quote that John Kerry said, which is, reflects the U.S. role. And he likes to say that the U.S. midwived the birth of South Sudan. The glorious revolution of 2018, 2019, women led. About 70% of revolutionaries were women. Professor Elamin has talked extensively about the significance of the revolution. Coming back to the conflict, the war. You have the two belligerents, the commander of the Sudanese Armed Forces, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and you have the paramilitary leader, former Janjaweed militiaman and warlord, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hemedti. Both of these generals were part of the power sharing agreement of the transitional civilian government that followed the revolution. They usurped the leadership of that government, Prime Minister Hamdok, in a coup in October 2021. This created a huge vacuum in governance, and revolutionaries went back on the streets, more blood was spilled, the international community reconvened and came up with something called the Sudan Framework Agreement in December of 2022. One of the main clauses was to require the integration of General Hemedti's paramilitary forces into General Burhan's Sudanese Armed Forces. And this was a point of contention. And there are a lot of thoughts about what sparked this war and what triggered the initial shots. And I mean, these two men have various motivations for starting the fighting. They are both incredibly politically ambitious, and they both want control over the central government of Sudan. They both have amassed massive economic and financial empires. Jointly, they control 85% of Sudan's economy. And you see General Dagalo, General Hemedti, have control of many of the large gold mines in Darfur, and has entered into agreements with the Wagner Group, Russian Wagner Group, which we'll get into later. The ownership of the Sudanese Armed Forces parastatal companies, large agricultural schemes, slaughterhouses, livestock companies. I mean, it's just what it tells you is that there's no real commercial, independent, competitive private sector. What you have is complete state capture of the economy by these two men. And, there have been informal reports that General Hemedti is worth somewhere in the range of $7 to $8 billion, his enterprises. And, when you take that and the Sudanese Armed Forces control of most of the economy, you can see exactly what the situation is. They're also looking to escape accountability. They both perpetrated atrocious war crimes in the Darfur War. And finally, there is the role of the National Islamic Front and the old guard of Omar al-Bashir, who have been driven underground post-revolution and have been biding their time to try to come back to power. And so there are reports that they are allied with the Sudanese armed forces, but not totally under control of the Sudanese armed forces. So this gives you a very complex situation where you have, yes, two very clear belligerents, but you have the NCP, the Islamist cells of Omar al-Bashir also fighting as part of this war. Sudan has huge economic potential. It's ranked 11th in terms of arable land, gold, uranium, diamond, mineral deposits, 100 million heads of livestock, 45 million heads of poultry, some of the largest resources in the world. The largest producer of gum arabic, which of course we know goes into a lot of industrial inputs, Coca-Cola, pharmaceuticals. I mean, it's a very strategic commodity. Sudan has huge potential in the areas of solar and wind energy. It has the Nile River, sugar, ethanol production, leading in sorghum and sesame production. So Sudan has the potential to be a leader in the African continental free trade area. A leader in the fight against climate change and the SDGs, and a potential breadbasket of Africa. And this Professor Elamin has really expanded on. I really enjoyed that. Sudan and Russia and the Wagner Group. Here you can see the Wagner Group's presence in Africa. Sudan is one of the countries in which the Wagner Group operates. What's so significant about this? Well, Professor Elamin has talked about the role and the stake of some of the Gulf actors. I'd like to dive into the role and stake of Russia. Putin has made agreements with previously with al-Bashir to build a naval base in the Red Sea. So Russia and Sudan have had alliances and agreements for a number of years now. At the same time, what's interesting is that the Wagner Group is allied with the other side in the war, General Hemeti. And they've entered into gold concession mining agreements. And so there are huge quantities of gold that are smuggled illegally from Sudan to Dubai. And then some of that is blended gold, and some of that then is, those resources are transferred to Russia. So what's happening here is that you have huge economic resources that are leaving Sudan to fuel General Hemeti's ability to buy weapons. And so this gold is really financing his ability to buy weapons and drones. And at the same time, the Wagner Group is also benefiting enormously from this financial trade, and you're seeing some of those financial resources also fueling the war in Ukraine. The main processes right now that are critical or that are at the forefront of trying to end the war in Sudan, there are the Saudi-US-led Jeddah talks, there's the AU-IGAD expanded mechanism, and there's the neighboring countries' ministerial mechanism, which is led by Egypt. This tells you how complex this situation is. The Saudis and the Americans have really taken the lead from the start of the war, but more recently, the African Union and IGAD have created an expanded mechanism, and there are now negotiations where AU and IGAD is saying, let us take the lead, and where the US and some of the Gulf actors are being brought into this mechanism. But there's still a lot of work to be done. We still need to see more unification between these three mechanisms, because it's creating a lot of discombobulation and lack of direction in terms of who is leading in terms of resolving the war. There are three phases in terms of resolution of the war. So there is the ability to achieve an immediate ceasefire. So far, about 12 ceasefires have been violated. The second phase is to achieve a sustained cessation of hostilities, which is in essence a peace agreement. And then after that, the really important phase is how do we return to a process to a civilian democratic transition. And I think really I'll end there. I mean, there have been a lot of discussions with policymakers about how do you achieve an immediate end to the war. And I think that there have been a lot of discussions about the UN Security Council's role in terms of enforcing, putting in place, establishing a no-fly zone, expanding the Darfur arms embargo to the entirety of Sudan. What you see is a lot of hesitation around that because of the assessment that Russia and China will just veto anything that comes up when it comes to Sudan in the Security Council. There have been sanctions put in place by the UN, the US, and the EU, but on both sides, on both belligerents, mostly to impede their ability to their economic flows. And I mean, so there have been actions taken by the international community, but what we're saying is not enough has been done so far. Thank you very much.
Well, hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, for this opportunity, and all the organizers for this opportunity for us to come and share with you about the situation in Sudan. I would like to thank Dr. Elamin and Samah for laying the ground for our talk today. I'm not going to go into repeating what they have said. But what I wanted to do is to emphasize the current situation and its impact on the people of Sudan, and what needs to be done, and whether and the kind of like the way the international community currently approaching the crisis, and how we can change that. Well, the crisis in Sudan today is a crisis of a global magnitude that require a global response. If I can tell, I can't even begin to describe what the situation looked like as the crisis in Sudan entered into its 5th month. Today, the rapid support forces occupying civilian homes in Khartoum, forcing people out of their homes. If people refuse, they shoot and take their belongings, using the population as human shield, simply. They committed horrendous act of violence and all kind of violation of human rights and violations of international humanitarian laws, including systematically using rape and sexual violence as a method of terrorization against women and girls. Many credible resources reported that women have been systematically and constantly raped and taken away from their families. Right now, there is a huge list of missing girls and women who have been abducted, and many credible report confirm that women have been taken from Khartoum as far as some remote areas in Darfur, and also across across the borders into the neighboring countries. At the same time, in confrontation between them, unfortunately, the war is being fought against civilians. It is not the way right now, the narrative that they use, that they are fighting one another, but people are falling victims between the fires of the Sudan armed forces and the rapid support forces. As the rapid support forces, as I mentioned, occupy civilians' homes, Sudan armed forces bombing civilian homes, bombing services like electricity, water sources, bridges, markets, you can name it. In a systematic way, you can't even understand how do they are trying to justify this. Because as all the reports, we haven't seen many of the reports that confirming the army is bombing the rapid support forces bases. Rather, they are bombing civilians' homes. Every day, we receive horrific report of families completely being wiped out by the government airstrike or shelling and heavy artillery firing within the center in Khartoum. From April 15 today, as we all know, Khartoum housed more than 9 million. Of those 9 millions, only about 1 million people were able to flee, about 600,000 who fled in the first month. These are the people who are able and can afford to flee Khartoum. Also, these are the people who may survive without going out every day working to produce and survive. The remaining number of population, they are trapped, most of whom either they are government workers or working in petty trade or daily laborers and other private sector employees who did not receive any salaries since April. They cannot work. They can't even provide food for themselves. So people are trapped and given only two options, either to die by bullets or die by starvation. Unfortunately, in the early days, even in Khartoum, the communication cut has imposed unimaginable condition of hardship. People who are starved and traumatized in their homes were found dead because they could not call to ask for help. And the fighting was too extensive outside, right in front of their homes. War crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed inside Khartoum. While this is happening today in Khartoum, the situation and what is taking place in Darfur is very different. In Khartoum, oftentimes we see the government, army, and the rapid support forces confronting one another, competing over some strategic areas like the military headquarters, the airport, the multiple military base, and where the military industry is located. So these are the areas where we see, but in most cases, they are fighting in the middle of the civilians' homes. This constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, and under international law, no forces should be fighting in the middle of the civilians. Unfortunately, it did happen in Sudan, and it is ongoing as of today. But the same war that is taking place and the narrative that is being used, it's completely different what is going on in Darfur. In Darfur, the rapid support force is systematically targeting civilians on ethnic basis. And what makes it dangerous is that recently 10 leaders of Arab tribes have declared their support to the rapid support forces, which means now they have more support, more fighters, and more moral and financial support to continue to systematically target the indigenous African tribe that have been targeted 20 years ago. So the situation that took place, or the incident that took place in Al Junaina, it was the most horrific and indescribable act of violence that have not been seen in the recent history. People ask about, in comparison to 2003 and today, the incident in Al Junaina, it has not been witnessed even in 2003. This is the rapid support forces come into the city. First, what they do, they make sure that they isolate the civilians in that city from all survival means. They go to the markets, they loot it, and they burn it. They go to civilians' home, loot it, and burn it. They go to the warehouses where food is stored, like such as the World Food Program storage. They loot it and they burn it. In Al Junaina, they poisoned water sources. There was only one water source that the people of Al Junaina relied on. Children were given 2 cups of water during the month of June, one in the morning and one in the evening, to survive on that. Sometimes adults will compromise. People were trying to flee, they were forced to stay. Those who have been killed, thrown in front of their relative, and they refused for their relative to bury the dead bodies of their dead immediate relatives. As of June 14, when the governor of Al Junaina was killed, 5,000 people were killed in Al Junaina. 8,000 people were wounded, and they were in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. They were prevented and refused by the rapid support forces for their families to take them to a place where they can be treated. And on June 15, the governor of West Darfur, he was killed in the most horrific and brutal way, and many more people have been killed, recorded by the rapid support forces and live broadcasted to the world to see. Their immediate family members living here right with us in the United States to watch their families like that. I've never wished to live, as I said this several times, to see something like that happen. People are killed, their bodies were degraded and recorded by the perpetrator. And how we say it is systematic and it mounts genocide after they killed all these people. 50,000 people were escorted by the rapid support forces, telling them that you have to leave. Now Al Junaina is being liberated from the Abid, which is the word slave in Arabic. And it is no longer Dar Masalit, which is the homeland of Masalit. Now it's the land of Arab. So it's quite clear the intention and the pattern that the rapid support forces use. Immediately after Al Junaina, they went into Zalinji, Wadi Saleh, Mustare. These are names I mentioned for you. It may not mean anything, but these are cities that are largely inhabited by the indigenous African tribe that were targeted for extermination since 2003. When they go to these cities, they do the same as what they did in Al Junaina, cutting people out of communication, cutting them of access to food, water, medicine, and they loot civilians' vehicles so that if people want to flee or if there are people who are in need of humanitarian assistance, they cannot seek that assistance. 2 other cities in North Darfur were attacked and completely emptied of its population. So you can see what the situation simply look like. Today in Darfur, more than 99% of Darfur is completely controlled by the rapid support forces. In some instance, the Sudan armed forces are there. They stick into staying in their headquarters without intervening to protect the people or to fight back against the rapid support forces. So even though they disagree among themselves, when it comes to Darfur, they do agree in destroying and putting the people of Darfur through this horrifying condition. And why they are insisting in Darfur? Because Darfur is a strategic place of a significant importance in Sudan because it is bordering multiple countries. So they are intending to control Darfur, occupying these areas, forcing civilians out so that they can launch again from there to control the Sudan. Controlling Darfur doesn't mean the rapid support forces will stay there. And that is a problem that right now we don't see when people talk about it in conversation, and that is the danger of what the rapid support force is doing. Even though the rapid support forces, most of them are militias recruited by the government, by the very regime that's currently fighting against them, they are coming, they are Sudanese from Arab origin who mobilize and brainwash. They are the most marginalized and the most excluded. But now the government has brainwashed them and brought them in, telling them that if you don't fight to liberate this land, then these Africans will remove you from the land. So they have been given a promise that they will occupy the land of these people. That's why they are fighting in a very motivated and precise manner to make sure that they force these people out and they control and occupy the land. And they are saying it publicly. So most of their forces, as I said, they are locally, but also they have forces from other countries, from Chad, Central African Republic. Niger has been the most contributing country to the rapid support forces. While they are fighting in Khartoum and in Sudan, they have been receiving recorded videos online showing them the support. They say they will establish an empire in Sudan. So the danger of presence of these multinational forces, we know that Sudan has a history of terrorism. We know Niger, Mali, and all these countries, they have from Boko Haram to Malian jihadists, they have. So if this has not been addressed, it will be an ISIS type of militias that if they are forced in Sudan, they can run into another country and they will be surviving there and they can go back and forth. And that is why it is very important that the international community and the regional actors intervene sooner than later, because if they do not intervene right now to address this issue, at some point they will be forced to fight to protect their own security, especially the regions in the West, Central and Western African region. So today, as people are negotiating there, the rapid support forces is expanding its control, and they are in an attempt to create two governments, at least if they are unable to take over Sudan. They are planning, as the army move into Port Sudan, created their own capital. Right now, the government is running out of Eastern Sudan in Port Sudan. They want to create a capital in Khartoum, and they will be controlling Darfur and Western and Kordofan, so that they can launch again and move into. Samah and Nisrin have touched into the involvement of regional actors. Of course, we, the Sudanese people, have to take the responsibility of what has been happening in Sudan. What is happening today, it is the extension of the genocide that started 20 years ago in Darfur that has been left unaddressed. The people who have been driven out of their homes, they remain in camps for 20 years. Imagine, children were born and raised, they have known nothing but war and destruction, and their entire life being taken away from them by living in makeshift camp for more than 20 years, lacking minimal of the basic need that they need as children to grow. And at the time when the crisis in Darfur, the genocide in Darfur was going, and this is how this regime has orchestrated this and divided the Sudanese people, and they were able to manipulate and bring Sudan to this situation. While the crisis in Darfur was ongoing, the rest of Sudan, people were very quiet. It seems like this was the issue concerning only the people of Darfur. And that is why, because the government has divided people, when they came with their Islamic project in the early 90s, they felt that unless they manipulate the people of Sudan, that they are failing. And then to their disappointment, they think Darfuri people are the most religious. They will be easy to motivate and mobilize to support that project. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. So they launched against the people of Darfur, but they turned people, divided people across ethnic, geographic, and economic lines, and all kind of divide and conquer policies. So most people in Sudan were quiet. When the ICC has referred the case of Darfur to the UN Security Council has referred the case of Darfur to the ICC. Investigation happened. There were an opportunity to pursue accountability. Most Sudanese were saying we must try al-Bashir inside Sudan, while all judiciary institutions are manipulated, politicized, and it was impossible to try them. So we missed that opportunity. And because of also another fact that they use all the resources in the country to militarization of the country. So they believe that if they can hold into power, control economy, they can continue to do whatever they want to do, and they can stay in power. So now this crisis is a cost of immunity because of the lack of accountability, even though the ICC has brought charges and arrest warrants against several suspects. The government has not collaborated, but also the majority of Sudanese, they did not understand that pursuing justice will deter this belligerent from attacking or destroying the Sudan or bringing this current crisis to Sudan as we have witnessed today. So now these generals right now fighting, to put it right, it is not about the two generals. It is the Islamic regime. We know only in 2019, as I said, those divisions that the government has created over the years, this division and also the suffering and the violation of human rights continue to enter into every single household. Only in 2019, when the people of Sudan have decided that, you know what, it is not about the people of Darfur, it is not about the people of Nuba Mountain or South Kordofan or the South Sudan, but it is the government in the center that have destroyed the Sudan and destroyed the people of Sudan. And then they came out and protested, toppled Bashir. Even though Bashir was ousted, his totalitarian regime remained very present. And during the interim period, unfortunately, mistakes has been made. The civilian part of the government, they signed constitution declaration that gives the military immunity while they are in government, and that also gave them the opportunity to participate in government. So they came and then they manipulated the interim period. All the gains that the people of Sudan have brought during the interim period have been wiped out by the October 21 coup. And then after the coup, they started orchestrating when negotiations started to bring the civilian government back. They did not want to bring the civilian government back, but they wanted to find a way to manipulate, and that is why tension was high among them, because there was a discussion about restructuring the forces and isolating the military. They have to be back into taking working on the military affair rather than letting the civilian to lead the government. Now I will try to jump into concluding this, but saying to why the international attention has not been focused in the situation in Sudan. Unfortunately, when the war erupted, it was too brutal for everyone. All the international and diplomats have evacuated Sudan. And this is a mistake that we have seen happen in Rwanda when the UN forces left. Genocide in Rwanda has taken place. And I think that was the biggest mistake. If the international stayed and told this belligerent that if you commit any violation against this, we are going to stop you. And unfortunately, they left the people of Sudan alone. And now it is hard. They control the entire country and they are not willing. The negotiation taking place in Jeddah, it has been made more about the generals rather than about the people of Sudan. And that's why it has not produced any result. So I think the international community need to address the situation with the sense of urgency. And this is where we as a diaspora community come and the role that we can play. Those who are in the US, in Europe, these are our government. We must speak to them. And also the approach that has been used, whether the civilians right now, they are gathering, trying to develop the priorities, or the negotiations that are taking place, I think Sudan needs an atrocity prevention approach. Looking at previous examples like Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, Liberia, when those perpetrators were taken away, the people of those countries were able to come together and negotiate peace and destabilize their countries. So I think starting with robust intervention to protect civilians, opening humanitarian corridor, and then pursuing accountability, then peace will take its course at that moment. But using the same approach that has been used over the years, it has been always that negotiation happening while those in power continue to fight. So those who come to negotiation come with weakest position, and they are the one who manipulate these venues, and we will end up with failure, as Dr. Elamin has pointed out. So I think, unfortunately, we have seen how the international community mobilized for Ukraine, and we are very happy because the Ukrainian people deserve that. But unfortunately, when it comes to crisis in Africa, the international, especially the US government and other international community, there is less attention and less. But let me tell you, I'm an advocate, and I think we have to push the boundary. We have to hold them accountable, that in the face of atrocities, it is known based on those international laws that they pledge to uphold. Under international law, the protection of civilians, the priority goes to the government. But when the government is endangering civilians' life, then the international community has the responsibility to protect, intervene, and protect the people, to save life and to bring solution. And that is where we have to invest, using their laws and holding them accountable with those. So I will stop here and will be more than happy to answer if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you so very much to all three of our panelists for such sweeping, comprehensive, and yet nuanced accounts that help us to understand and grapple with the current situation, conflict, genocide happening in Sudan today, placing it in a historical and global context, and underscoring repeatedly the necessity for more positive intervention than the current one we see in terms of the international order. As they pointed out, the international order, the international community is already involved and implicated, and we need to redirect our attention and our support in ways for more positive outcomes. So thank you all. I'm going to open it up to our panelists to potentially pose questions to one another, and then open it up to the broader audience, both online and in person, to ask some questions. So first, panelists, do you have questions for one another? Or should we open it up? Please don't be shy.
I mean, I have a question for Professor Elamin. Do you want me to use the microphone or just speak? I can just, speak. Yeah, okay. So, so Professor Elamin, I really appreciated how you laid out the context for the agricultural sector, the land grabs, how the Gulf states are securing their food security needs out of Sudan. I've been a practitioner in the Sudan agricultural sector, so that's why I have such a deep appreciation for your analysis there. So I have two questions, and my first question is, we always talk about Sudan's potential to be a food basket for the region, for Africa, even for the world. You talked a lot about some of the impediments, and this is a huge topic. It could be its own session, so I won't go too deep. But I wanted you're focusing in the area of land reform, and I agree with many of the statements with your analysis. Wondering if you have thoughts about investment policy reform. So, for example, in Ukraine, Ukrainian wheat, Australian wheat is some of the most heavily subsidized in the world. Dairy farms in the Netherlands and New Zealand, some of the most heavily subsidized in the world. And the reason I'm talking about this is because Sudan right now is on the verge of a looming famine, and also because Sudan has huge agricultural potential. So in coming out of this world war, agriculture needs to play a huge role in supporting livelihoods. So have you looked at the fact that Sudan's approach towards farmers has been very punitive? So lots of agricultural taxes, custom duties for exports. And do you have any views around what needs to change in order to create a more a friendlier environment for smallholder farmers to be able to till their land and to actually make farming, to allow them to have successful, farming enterprises, and for this to, create a sort of ecosystem that allows Sudan to become the breadbasket for Africa, for the Middle East, and for the world. I'd just like to hear your thoughts. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think it does require like more time than we might have, but I think one of the things that I've learned in my research, and it's again very limited to Central Sudan. I mean, Niemat talked about kind of the massive displacement that has happened in Darfur. Most of those people who were displaced were farmers, right?
Yeah.
So there's also a huge impact on Darfur in terms of the agricultural sector. But speaking about Central Sudan, the people that I've worked with, many are working with an independent farmers union. As you know, the al-Bashir regime, when it first came to power, one of its first things it did is sort of destroy trade unions and like really as a way of maintaining their power. And so it took a while for there's an independent landless workers association in Central Sudan, and also an independent small farmers union. And some of their kind of agendas are a little bit different, but I think one of the sort of unifying issues that has come up is that people want to form cooperatives, and that they need support from the state to form smallholder cooperatives, a little bit modeling on the Via Campesina in Latin America, where in some countries there are these sort of large cooperatives that work together to provide some of the larger inputs into farming, and that hold some kind of decision-making power over how things are done, right? Whether it's crop selection, the kinds of seeds, et cetera. And so, I think, again, I think a lot of people are not against investment, but they're looking for the kind of investment that could support cooperatives. And the other thing that I didn't mention is 70% of the labor on the farms in Central Sudan is done by landless workers from a lot of war-impacted areas like Darfur, but also other parts of the country, and some are also like people who are from the Jazeera, but whose ancestors a long time ago came from West Africa. And so and I think there's a real need for us to once the war is over and we get to full civilian rule, to really rethink the system of land laws in Sudan that we inherited from the British, that are really it's a framework that allows the state and state elites to extract communal land and other lands from smallholder farmers, that has not also addressed the needs of landless workers, many of whom want to buy land but are prevented from it for a variety of reasons that I can't get into. So this is also the system of debt that you mentioned, and so forth. So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of supporting farmers, but also in terms of thinking along the lines of cooperatives.
Okay, thank you. I want to make sure also our colleague who's online, Niemat, in case you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put up your hand or just speak. Any other questions?
Yeah, I wanted just to add to what Nisrin has said in regard to agriculture. By the way, before the crisis in Darfur and Kordofan were producing about 60%, contributing by 6% of the total agricultural production. I think gum Arabic is one of the most famous that Sudan can contribute or export about 80% of the total world's production. This include use in cosmetic, medicine, beverage, alcohol, so many products that almost every single person in the world has used. And this comes mostly from Darfur and Kordofan. And because of people who have been active producers being put to become depending on humanitarian aid, this has hugely impacted the economic situation. And because of that, we have economic crisis. In terms of the livestock, also these two areas contributing largely, in addition to another number from Blue Nile and Eastern Sudan. And these are all areas who are hardly hit by crisis, and that is why. So I think also it's important to reflect this, how the war affect also the economy and affecting the economic balance. When the international community, sometimes they always like quick to talk about the economic crisis rather than the crisis that affected the people, but they are very intertwined and interrelated. And because of our people are unable to produce and rely on themselves, then that also has hit the country hard. And because of that, the 2019 crisis was early started because of the rise in food prices as well. And additionally, I wanted to add one point is that in all this depressing situation that we have been talking about, we were really empowered and encouraged by the resilience of the people of Sudan, something that sometimes people don't, and especially in the international spaces, people need to look at that and talk about, because when all the international walk away, people wasted no time, even in the middle of bombing, young people, women, civil society leaders start coming out and aiding their people, taking those who in need of emergency assistance to hospital, gathering food, money, clothing, helping those in need, housing people who lost their homes. And mostly the international actors, when they come, in most cases, they use these local capacities to implement their project, rather they don't empower them. So in our advocacy and looking forward, any intervention in Sudan, these local actors must be empowered, and then also institutional capacity for their organization, so that in the future, we learned these two lessons in 2009 when President Bashir have expelled all the humanitarian agencies. The local communities and the local and national organization stepped in to fill that gap. And again, now that is still happening. And then most donors, they are trying to say, oh, well, how do we get money to them? How do we help them? The diaspora have been getting the money. So there need to be also flexibility to do that and support the people. And because of that, we emphasize that if you want to resolve the crisis, you have to empower those who are impacted, and not just empowering them, but also having them on the table wherever there is discussion, and they must contribute to any decision about any intervention, whether it's peace, accountability, or emergency responses, or long-term peace building.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Elamin, did you have
I just wanted to add, for people who want to support, right? There is, I mean, this is focused on Khartoum, but there's a website, khartoumerr.org, where you can read about the work of the emergency response rooms. We at the University of Toronto, the students and some faculty have organized a collective. We're trying to start a fund that is fiscally sponsored through the Darfur Diaspora Association in Toronto. We have informally been funding the efforts of resistance committees, especially around the emergency response in Khartoum and in Niala in Darfur, have also supported the tea vendors union, it's mostly women who sell tea in Khartoum, and the farmers union that I mentioned, the independent farmers union in Jazeera. Now we funded them in very small amounts, a couple $1,000s here and there, but I just want to mention this. The website is going to be sudansolidarity.com. If you'd like to, and when I launch it, I'll send it to you, but that might be an opportunity for you to donate. The money will go directly to the people on the ground who are doing this emergency response.
Thank you so much for that. We'll definitely look out for that and send the information out. And if it's not too disruptive, and it is possible, if you could write out, so maybe we can ask Christian to send it through the chat to folks or online. Thank you. Thank you. And to our audience who's here, does anyone have any questions? Okay, maybe while you're thinking about that, I see that there's a few questions. There's at least one question online and a few comments in the form of a chat. So I'm going to open the Q&A box now. So for all panelists, in your experience, does the average civilian feel invested in the conflict and support one side or the other? Or is the political aspect completely disconnected from their lives? Thank you to the anonymous participant for that question. I don't know if anyone, do average civilians feel invested in this conflict, or does the political conflict feel completely disconnected from their lives?
I mean, mean, I'll say so I was in Sudan the first couple of weeks of the war, and I remember a couple of days into the war, we had run out of food, and young people from the neighborhood resistance committees helped us both eventually evacuate, but also distributing water and food. And so I say this, that I think a lot of the relief efforts that young people are leading, who are members of the resistance committee, is actually very political, right? It's them sort of stepping in to fill the void of an absent state. And I think that's why it's so critical to support them over even some, there needs to be humanitarian assistance for sure. Like the international humanitarian aid commitment has been very minimal. So I'm not trying to say no, none of that. But I think for the ordinary person in the United States or anywhere, it's better you support those groups because these are political actors, right? Even though they're not being taken seriously as political actors. One of the things I think the revolution did, at least in again, Khartoum, Central Sudan, that's the area I can speak to the most, is that it politicized people, and that it really made them feel invested in, and engaging in a popular democratic way in politics in a way that I hadn't seen before. I think in the past, people have felt, as Niemat explained, quite disconnected from the politics, certainly of the state and state violence in the peripheral regions, because it didn't really impact them. But I think what we saw also with this war, but also in the revolution, we saw, like, for example, the June massacre of the breakup of the sit-in. We saw the long war arrive in Khartoum, and I think that also awakened people. So I do think that civilians are engaged in politics. I will say I'm concerned, and I see this in the diaspora as well a little bit, of more and more people supporting the army, right, as the kind of lesser of two evils, as the possible kind of, salvation for this, resolution of this regime, and I think of this war. And I think that is a mistake and a danger. And I think there's a bit of amnesia, and again, this is coming sort of from Central Sudanese privilege, perhaps, of like forgetting that the army is responsible also for these war crimes that span decades, and that they produced in many ways the RSF. It was a part of al-Bashir's coup-proofing to kind of elevate the RSF into development, et cetera. But the point being that I think it's very dangerous to be considering the SAF as a benevolent potential, for bringing us towards civilian rule.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Professor Elamin is saying, when you take the frame and the context of the 2018-2019 revolution of Sudan, and you see the number of youth that led that revolution, and it was a women and youth-led revolution, those revolutionaries and people like Professor Elamin, myself, who backed that revolution to oust a dictator like Omar al-Bashir, these are people who are saying no to the war, that the war must stop. So the sides to the war, there is one broad front that says, we're not taking the military side or the RSF side. They're both bad, and the war has to stop. And that's a side, if you can call it that, a side. And it's a big population of young people who are saying, just end this war and end it now, end the suffering, end the indignity, the deaths, the rape, the looting, the killing, all of that. And then, just as Professor Elamin said, there is a smaller growing faction of people who are supporting the military. Some of it is out of retribution. So people who have women who have been raped in their families by members of the RSF who are saying, we want revenge on the RSF, or people who are saying, well, we need to get rid of the RSF and we'll deal with the military later. Again, very short-sighted, I think, strategies. And then the RSF have also recruited out of certain areas of Sudan. And so there are factions, that support the RSF. But I think, the main movement is one of an anti-war movement.
I can add to that. Actually, of course, in the very beginning, people were mostly against war, but down the road, both sides have been launching on online marketing and manipulation scheme, and also mobilization to recruit, including the Sudan Armed Forces, calling for people to come and pick up arm and to support their people. So some people, as in response to the outrage, their young people are trying to join, but in most cases, people especially in the case of Darfur. People say we don't have side to choose because both sides have committed atrocities. In Darfur, it was first the government army that committed atrocities in Darfur, then they brought Janjaweed in. So it is very hard to see, but like currently there is a lot of online hostility in between. Some people, yes, of course, like kind of like clapping like two sport teams. Some people were really angry about the Islamic regime, and they say they kind of like sideline with the rapid support forces, but not many. And then there are some people who are supporting, but the overwhelming majority are not with any side, but they are, and especially people within the civil society, women group that I'm involved, they say both parties must be out of the picture if there's any solution to be made in Sudan.
There's a question about higher education, right? I saw that earlier. I don't know where, maybe the chat.
Let me check the chat then. Sorry, I have this over colleagues. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, I'll read out the question. How has the education system in Sudan been impacted by the current unrest?
So I wanted to just briefly say something. I unfortunately have to leave soon because my flight. But I wanted to say that there was a decree that was just issued by the Ministry of, I guess, Higher Education in Sudan, basically declaring all universities, you know, like kind of saying that no universities should function for an entire year, and that anybody who's taken exams in August, there were a couple of universities that attempted to allow some of their students, because a lot of the students, April, right, is sort of that time where like people are several weeks away from graduating. So there are a lot of students, I think we estimate about 1 million university students have had their education, you know, interrupted. So yeah, so and so, you know, I think this decree, I think it's a bit complicated, but I think one of the aims people think for the army to be able to recruit people. And so I think there is a role to play by universities in the diaspora, right? By George Washington University, for example, there is an association of Sudanese American professors. There's also a Scholars for Peace in Sudan group that is trying to work on a number of different initiatives. One is to digitize the transcripts. Most of the transcripts are on servers in Sudan, so there's negotiations that will have to happen to get the data from those servers out. But I think there is IT and sort of financial support that universities can lend to have a platform where students, because you know it'll have to be multiple for students to access their digitized transcripts. That's of course a very first step. I think the second would be to think about beyond scholars at risk programs and spots for Sudanese scholars who are at risk, who have been displaced, would be to actually support regional universities in Kampala, in Nairobi, in Dar es Salaam, but also in the Middle East, to open up spots for for displaced Sudanese students, to eliminate the bureaucracy, to have scholarships for them available, etc. And I think some of that support can come from North American universities to kind of build the capacity, because we might be able to create, say, 50 scholar at risk positions in North America. Then there'll be a whole visa regime that will probably make it difficult for especially more marginalized scholars to come to North America. Whereas I think there's much more potential, let's say, for opening up the University of Cape Town or Makerere University or University of Nairobi, to both students and faculty, and to have those faculty maybe teach online, be able to provide support that way, and accreditation, etc. So I think there are some avenues that people in the diaspora are exploring that certainly people can support and get involved in.
Thank you for underscoring that, and also underscoring our location here and how we can be.
Yeah, I just wanted also to add to that, and I also will have to run. I'm checking out of my room. So, actually, we have educational crises, as Dr. Elamin said, but just to bring you back, from 2019 up to now, there hasn't been a full 2 years of education in Sudan. The demonstration continued. Most schools, universities were closed. Then COVID-19 hit, and then the coup. This all has affected the flow of education in Sudan, and now the war. So we have, if the war doesn't stop right now, I think we have an educational crisis, and we have a lost generation, because some people are growing and without getting that education, people abandoning schools, and this is something that the military will favor, to have young people without schooling so that they can continue to recruit into their. So I think one thing we can do is, in addition to what Ms. Elamin said, is to ending the war is the #1 priority. If we can have to restore education back, but then if we have to find alternative of being able, if there's any emergency intervention that prioritize education, also supporting the universities and schools in Sudan to have an online system, because we didn't have that during COVID-19. People were unable to learn even at university level. So that is also something that we can put for USAID and other agencies that support education. They have huge schemes in the post-conflict or after the stop of war, so that we can bridge the gap between these all 5 years of lost education time.
Thank you so much for that. I want to ensure you're able to check out, and also Dr. Elamin is able to make her flight. Can you all join me again in thanking our speakers for their expertise and so generously giving of their time during a period where there are a lot of demands on you to be here. This is part of an ongoing conversation, including the mention of the potential role we can play here, located as we are in education institutions, and also part of the international networks, systems that are absolutely implicated in what's happening and how we can redirect things towards more positive ends. So thank you again. Thank you. Niemat, I hope you get to check out.
Yeah, I feel that they're knocking on the door, but thank you so much for this opportunity, and we look forward to support you in any way possible. And also, I would like to urge our audience, especially students who have a lot of power. We have seen the students' movement before in the early crisis of Darfur, and only the international community cared when citizens went out and spoke. Use your voice and speak up for the people of Sudan. And the international community have a lot of double standard, but we must speak up and exercise our voices and hold them accountable to their own laws and norms that they have declared and pledged to uphold. And unless we do so, they're not going to do anything. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all. Hope to see you again.